When Senator Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, his mind was focused on the building of a railway and nothing more. In fact, his supporters claimed the act had permanently settled the slavery issue. Everything else was the political horse trading needed to pass the bill, in his mind. They were completely wrong. By expanding popular sovereignty, Douglas unknowingly tipped the first domino leading to the American Civil War by opening a wound called Bleeding Kansas. Welcome to our latest video on the American Civil War, in which we will cover the opening salvos of the bloodiest conflict in United States history. From the border skirmishes in Kansas to the abolitionist firebrand John Brown, the cannons fired at Fort Sumter, and the first Battle of Bull Run. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. The Compromise of 1850 created popular sovereignty, but it took the Kansas-Nebraska Act to make it relevant. Slavery was never going to take root in the Utah or New Mexico territories. Cotton couldn't handle their climates, and the formerly Mexican population of those territories, expanded by the 1853 Gadsden Purchase, was strongly anti-slavery. Similarly, Nebraska was too far north climate-wise and too near free states for pro-slavery settlers to claim realistically. Kansas, however, was next to slaveholding Missouri and potentially more hospitable to plantation agriculture. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups planned to send massive expeditions to settle and claim Kansas. However, organizing them proved prohibitively difficult, and instead, steady trickles of settlers made their way to Kansas. Pro-slavery Missourians were the first to act, establishing the first towns and governments. However, free soilers were arriving in greater and greater numbers, so the pro-slavery settlers made the bold decision to cheat. To that end, armed Missouri residents from border towns began swarming across into Kansas to cast pro-slavery votes before returning home, ensuring that the first territorial legislature and congressional representative would favor slavery. However, the fraud was quickly exposed, and free soilers set up their own government in Topeka. The pro-slavery border ruffians responded by aggressively intimidating free soil voters, and again fraudulently voted on the new state constitution, sending the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution to Congress, which the equally pro-slavery President Pierce welcomed. This prompted the free soilers to form their own militias and create their own constitutions. With the situation spiraling out of control, the border ruffians moved to open violence. A series of isolated murders were followed by the sacking of Free Soil Lawrence on May 21, 1856. In retaliation, firebrand abolitionist John Brown attacked pro-slavery settlers on Pottawatomie Creek, killing 5. Violence escalated until October, when a new governor managed to broker a truce. However, clashes between anti-slavery Jayhawker militia and pro-slavery bushwhackers continued until 1865. The fallout from the fighting in Kansas caused a major political realignment. Democratic President Pierce was already isolated after his political ineptitude alienated everyone else in the party. His unwavering support for the border ruffians made it worse. Northern and Western Democrats blamed Pierce and other pro-slavery Democrats for the party's hammering in the 1854 midterms. These Western and Northern Democrats began advocating Douglas's moderate position rather than Pierce's overt pro-slavery attitude. Meanwhile, the Whig Party already teetered on collapse over supporting the Fugitive Slave Act. When its leadership also supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the anti-slavery wing left the party. In Michigan and Wisconsin, they quickly joined forces with existing anti-slavery third parties and Democrats opposed to slavery's expansion to form the Republican Party. By 1856, the Whigs were gone. As the Republicans gained strength across the North, Southerners began panicking. The Republican platform of defending free soilers in Kansas, preventing slavery in every other territory, and ending slave power's domination of national politics ran counter to everything the South believed in and stood for. The South immediately framed Republicans as literal monsters who threatened their way of life. The temperature continued to rise during the 1856 presidential campaign. The Republicans nominated the explorer and soldier John C. Fremont. After a lengthy convention fight, the Democrats nominated James Buchanan. He was sold to non-Southerners as an experienced diplomat whose conciliatory nature would heal wounds within the party and the nation. However, these were mere obfuscations. Despite his long diplomatic career, Buchanan had never held a decision-making position. In truth, he was a people pleaser who hated confrontation, shirked responsibility, and avoided decision-making. His loyalty to Southern interests won Buchanan the nomination, not his qualities. Despite being Pennsylvanian, Buchanan had long sought to expand U.S. territory and influence in the Caribbean and South America to benefit slavery, and was willing to go along with any pro-slavery demand. This was everything the Southern Democrats wanted in a candidate, to the frustration of the rest of the party. The 1856 election was bitter, as the Deep South threatened to secede if Fremont won. The Democrats campaigned on Fremont being the physical manifestation of Southern fears and the secession threat. Fremont ran on preventing slavery's spread and Pierce's acceptance of the fraudulent pro-slavery government in Kansas. Fear of conflict allowed Buchanan to win handily, but he quickly caused a wildfire. During this time, the United States Supreme Court was dominated by Southerners, most with slaveholding families. A few days before his inauguration, one justice told Buchanan about the upcoming ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford. As the Southern majority hoped, Buchanan immediately pushed Justice Robert Grier, a fellow Pennsylvanian, to join the majority and allow Chief Justice Robert Taney to issue the sweeping ruling he needed without appearing sectarian. On March 6, 1857, 2 days after Buchanan mentioned it in his inaugural address, Taney released the worst ruling in American legal history. The original pre-Buchanan opinion ruled that Scott had no standing to sue as a slave, and so the court voided the suit. However, Taney also added the sweeping conclusion that only whites were or could be citizens. The Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and slavery had to be allowed in the territories. Taney intended this to be the end of the slavery issue, making it a matter of settled law, not a political question. Instead, it was the Civil War's point of no return. The ruling was lauded by the slaveholding states and condemned by everyone else. Northerners seized on Justice Benjamin Curtis's 87-page dissent, which detailed all the case law and American history, clearly showing that black people were and always had been American citizens, evidence Taney deliberately ignored. Furthermore, overturning the Missouri Compromise was so far outside the bounds of Dred Scott's case that the only reason to even consider it was Taney's personal opinion. This was the final straw for Northerners, including a previously obscure one-term congressman named Abraham Lincoln. Republicans and Northern Democrats pointed to Buchanan's improper involvement in the case as proof that slave power would stop at nothing to impose slavery nationwide. They were already using violence to force slavery on Kansas, and now the pro-slavery president had conspired with Southern judicial activists to enshrine it nationally. The North rejected the Dred Scott decision, and support for the Republicans increased, especially as Buchanan did nothing to ease tensions or dispel accusations against himself. The confrontation was now inevitable. The North would not compromise on slavery in the territories. One man wanted that confrontation to be bloody and soon, and that man was none other than John Brown. The firebrand abolitionist had been fighting the bushwhackers in Kansas while leading raids into Missouri to liberate slaves, and was now looking to liberate every slave in America. He planned to seize the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, and use it to arm escaped slaves for a righteous slave rebellion, purging slavery with blood and fire. While he received financial support from prominent abolitionists, there's little evidence his backers knew the full extent of his plan. On October 16, 1859, Brown and 12 followers successfully seized Harpers Ferry. However, no slaves arrived to reinforce him. John had dispatched messengers to nearby plantations, but it's not clear if they actually told anyone to join Brown. Isolated, Brown was quickly surrounded by armed citizens and was captured by Marines, commanded by a certain Colonel Robert E. Lee on October 18th. After that, he was subsequently hanged. As Dred Scott had set the North's will to fight, Harper's Ferry ignited the South's. Brown's plan was the sum of all Southern fears, and the fact that many Northerners called Brown a martyr only confirmed that narrative. Southern minds were now set. If the Republicans ever came to power, it would mean the death of the South. They'd have to fight for slavery and, by extension, their own survival. It was under this cloud that the 1860 presidential campaign began. Lincoln had shown himself to be a moderate during the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates and subsequent speeches, and secured the Republican nomination after 3 ballots. It was hoped that his nomination would show Southerners that the Republicans weren't crazed fanatics, while appealing to the average Northerner. Meanwhile, the Democratic convention was in chaos. Douglas was nominated after 59 ballots and a venue change, but only after all Southern delegates stormed out after the convention rejected their plank of extending slavery to all territories, whether they'd voted for it or not. These Southern Democrats formed their own convention and nominated their own candidate, Vice President John Breckinridge. Those disaffected with the Republicans and Democrats nominated a 4th candidate, John Bell. Consequently, Lincoln won the Electoral College handily, though not the popular vote, despite more secession threats. Throughout the campaign, Lincoln had unambiguously stated that the president didn't have the power to end slavery unilaterally, and he would not touch slavery where it already existed. However, paranoid Southerners refused to believe it. To them, the incoming Republican-controlled Congress was a dagger to slavery's throat. Consequently, frantic slave owners prepared to carry out their secession threat. On December 10th, Buchanan made his final State of the Union address to Congress. He stated that while secession was not constitutional, the federal government lacked the power to prevent it. The South was outraged that he denied secession's legality, and the North was outraged that he intended to do nothing. Meanwhile, Buchanan ignored his Southern-staffed cabinet, supplying secessionists with weapons and money. 10 days later, South Carolina declared secession through an ordinance adopted at a special convention. By February, 6 other states had adopted similar measures, despite internal resistance. On February 8th, Southern leaders drafted a constitution in Montgomery, Alabama, and declared the formation of the Confederate States of America under President Jefferson Davis. Texas Governor Sam Houston, already strongly anti-secession, refused to swear loyalty to the Confederacy and was removed from office. Across the South, forts, arsenals, and other property owned by the federal government were located on federally owned land. However, most were only maintained by a few caretakers. The US Army only totaled 15,000 personnel, most of whom were stationed to protect Western settlers. Taking advantage, secessionist militia seized federal property. Northerners demanded a response, but yet again, Buchanan did nothing. As such, individual officers began taking their own initiative. On January 8, 1861, a secessionist mob attempted to seize Fort Barrancas in Pensacola. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Adam Slemmer, ordered them to disperse and then fired on them. 2 days later, following Florida's secession, his superiors surrendered the naval yard and joined the secessionists. Realizing that Barrancas and Fort McCree were indefensible, Slemmer destroyed all the weapons and supplies that couldn't be moved and retreated to nearby Fort Pickens, whose position was more defensible. Further south, the Navy reinforced its bases in the Florida Keys, while evacuating ships from southern ports. Pickens would be resupplied from there in April, and these forts remained in federal possession throughout the war. However, it would be Charleston Harbor that decided the issue. Charleston was defended by a federal arsenal, and a number of fortifications were commanded by Major Robert Anderson in Fort Moultrie. The War Department had ordered all garrisons to hold position and defend themselves if attacked, but Moultrie wasn't designed to defend against a landward assault. On December 26th, Anderson abandoned Moultrie for the more defensible Fort Sumter in the middle of the harbor. The next day, South Carolina militias seized Castle Pinckney. Moultrie and other fortifications were captured, alongside the arsenal on the 28th, placing Anderson in an undeclared siege. Buchanan refused to cede or to overtly support Sumter. Instead, he dispatched the civilian steamer Star of the West to reinforce and resupply Anderson on January 9th. Anderson didn't know about Starr's mission until the rebel batteries fired on it. By the time he was ready to provide covering fire, Starr had fled. Having made a half-hearted attempt, Buchanan decided Sumter was Lincoln's problem. Following rumored assassination plots in Baltimore, Lincoln snuck into D.C. for his March 4th inauguration. In his inaugural address, Lincoln pledged to defend federal property, reiterated that he would not interfere with slavery in the South, and promised not to fire the first shot. Davis had created a provisional Confederate army on February 28th and dispatched P.G.T. Beauregard to take command in Charleston. On March 6th, he called for 100,000 volunteers to defend the Confederacy. The two sides attempted to negotiate, but their positions were irreconcilable. Lincoln would not recognize the Confederacy, they would not back off on Fort Sumter. Consequently, Lincoln began arranging for another, more secretive supply mission. Confederate spies reported this to Davis, who authorized Beauregard to reduce Sumter if Anderson wouldn't surrender. The ultimatum was refused on April 11th, and at 04:30 on April 12th, the bombardment began. The two sides exchanged ineffective fire until 1400 on April 14th, when Anderson ran out of ammunition and surrendered. This heroic defense stirred the patriotism of the North. The Union was under threat by rebels who'd fired the first shot. The next day, Lincoln declared the South to be in open rebellion and called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to put it down. Upper South secessionists used this as an excuse to reopen secession, and 4 more states joined the Confederacy. Virginia's secession doubled Confederate industrial capacity and significantly increased its manpower, but its secession wasn't wholehearted. Its Appalachian counties were strongly Unionist and detested the Tidewater slaveholders. Consequently, the Unionists established a rival government in Wheeling. To solidify Confederate control, the capital was moved from Montgomery to Richmond on May 29th. Meanwhile, many existing federal and state regiments were marching towards Washington, while volunteers rushed to recruiting stations. This caused Maryland secessionists to panic, and on April 19th, a Baltimore mob attacked regiments moving through the city. In response, Lincoln ordered Baltimore occupied, habeas corpus suspended, and anyone with proven or suspected secessionist ties arrested. Maryland wouldn't be given the chance to secede. Simultaneously, George McClellan led Ohio volunteers to support the Wheeling government and successfully retake Western Virginia. Lincoln believed that the rest of the South was like the Western Virginians, and once federal troops appeared and defeated the rebels, they'd return to the Union. Davis likewise assumed that the North would give up once the actual fighting started. By July, about 35,000 soldiers were camped around Washington, the largest army ever assembled in North America. However, its training, equipment, and discipline were so poor, its commander, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, considered it more mob than army. However, he had no time to fix these problems before their 90-day enlistments started expiring. Besides, everyone knew that the war would be over with one decisive battle. Pushed by Lincoln and expiring enlistments, McDowell moved to attack Beauregard's 21,000 men camped near Manassas Junction on July 16th. His plan called for 3 columns to distract, pin, and finally flank the rebels, crushing them before driving on Richmond, ending the war. A separate column of 18,000 was to pin Joseph Johnson's 10,000 men in the Shenandoah Valley. McDowell's march was so disorganized that it took 5 days to march the 37 miles to Centerville, where Beauregard had prepared defensive positions behind Bull Run. Meanwhile, Johnson had slipped past the fixing troops and was transporting his men by railway to support Beauregard. Finding Beauregard's center and right too fortified to assault directly, McDowell instead flanked the unfortified left. The march started at 02:30, but the inexperienced soldiers got tangled up and didn't make the ford until 09:30. Meanwhile, Beauregard's headquarters in Wilmer McLean's house were hit by artillery fire at 05:15. He ordered a pinning attack on the Union left in response, but his commanders thought they were orders only to prepare an attack, and most never engaged. By 10 o'clock, 20,000 Union troops were moving up the Confederate left flank. 3,800 Confederates delayed them until 11:30 when the line broke. McDowell then halted to organize his mob, which proved disastrous. Delaying allowed Thomas Jackson's brigade to move into position and repel the attack until reinforcements arrived, earning Thomas the nickname Stonewall Jackson. Fighting raged across Henry Hill for the next 4 hours until Johnson finished arriving at 1600 and attacked the Union's right flank, forcing their retreat. McDowell's army retreated in good order until a wagon overturned and blocked Cup Creek Run Bridge. Panic spread through the army, probably started by the numerous civilians picnicking while watching the battle, and didn't stop routing until it reached Washington. The rebels didn't pursue it, as they didn't realize they'd won the battle. Of the 70,000 soldiers in the area, only 36,000 had engaged, suffering 4,700 total casualties. Both sides finally realized this war would be far harder and costlier than anticipated. In our next episode, the Union will miss its best chance for an early end to the war. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.